Hey, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co., and today we are doing math. This is going to be a math-based episode. Specifically, we're going into the pricing of board games, why the pricing is what it is, and also the main relevance over here is because of tariffs. I've seen a lot of people talk about the nature of the way tariffs are applied, to what part of the price of a board game they are applied, and why it shouldn't be as bad as people might think. And I want to kind of show you why, in some ways, it is. This is a very specific, localized conversation. I know I've talked a lot about tariffs. I'm sure I'll talk more about tariffs. I specifically want to talk about the pricing of board games to hopefully illustrate some of the more complex parts as to why when you say, hey, the tariff's only $5, just make the board game $5 more, it's never quite as simple as all that. It's complicated. Let's go ahead and dive into it. So, we're going to be talking about two different things. I guess we'll break it down into two main sections. The first is just the nature of the pricing of board games and just the logistics of literally the profitability of a company and where they can actually achieve profitability in general. So that's going to be the first part. We're not talking about tariffs at all in the first part. I'm just going into some math that I've talked about loosely in the past, but I'm going to hopefully break it down with a bit more, a few more examples so you can really picture what's going on. I bought a whole lot of sheets of paper. I won't need all of them, but I'm going to be showing you just kind of the full breakdown. And then the second half, we'll be talking about how how the pricing of tariffs work, and how that impacts the price of games, and why it's not always as clear as some people think it is. And some of the stuff is actually complicated. Like, some of the stuff I think is semi-intuitive, like once you hear it, you're like, oh, that makes sense. Other stuff, to me, it's not always immediately clear. When you get some math thrown into the mix, you're like, oh, I can see how that plays out. Meaning, I don't think this is all stuff to take at face value. There's a reason I'm doing this video, because it's not always easy. So let's start with the basic. Let's start with the first part, the pricing of board games. In general, in the past, I've talked about something called the 4 or 5 times rule of board games. I'm going to drop the 4 times right now. I'm going to focus on the 5, and I'll explain why. I think it makes the math a little easier to follow. Also, the 4 is kind of included in the 5. And then we'll talk about the fact that there are many, many people who use a higher multiplier, and we'll explain why there as well. Now, what does it mean, multiplier? It means that when you have a game that costs, let's say, if you're paying $60 for it in the store, that game probably costs $15-ish to produce. If you're a publisher watching this, I'm going to be using generalities first just to get to a regular point of understanding and then expanding it outwards from there. So let's go ahead and start that off and show you where this kind of breaks down. So let's say you're a publisher, you have a game, and that game, let's pretend that your game costs you $15 to manufacture. So game over here, you're gonna have to excuse my terrible writing and everything, but the game is a $15 to manufacture game, okay? It's just me $15. That's the price point to produce the game, okay? Easy enough. That's what it costs you to make it in the factory, $15. Well, you have to sell it for more than that to make a profit. But this is where the first thing you have to understand is the distribution pipeline effectively consists of a few main parts. There's more to it, but the basic parts are you have the publisher of the game. Publisher, why can't I spell all of a sudden? You have the producer, the people who actually are producing the game. You have the distributor. You have the local game store, or online or local, whatever you want to call it. Just call it game store. And then you have the customer, okay? Now, there's some other complexities to that. We'll talk more about those soon. But effectively, everyone in this chain, except for the customer, has to make money. And the customer is the main one providing that bulk amount of money. So effectively, you have the publisher who's going to pay $15 to the producer to make their game. So the producer makes $15, because again, that game costs $15 to make. Then the publisher is going to take that $15 game, they paid $15 for it, and they're going to sell it for $30 to the distributor. Okay, so the publisher sells it for $30 to the distributor, which means the publisher has made $15. The distributor takes that game that they just paid $30 for, and they turn around and they sell it to the game store for $45. Okay, so that game that is now sold for $45 to the game store. And the game store sells it to the customer for $60, which effectively means everyone along this pathway made $15. It's a little more complicated than that. Every one of these steps is, but effectively everyone made $15. The producer charged $15 to make the game. This part's already more complicated because they obviously have their cost of materials and all that, but they charged $15 to the publisher. The publisher then turns around and sells that game to the distributor for $30. So again, they paid $15, they sold it for $30, they make $15 per copy. The distributor sells that $30 game to the game store, they make $15 per copy. The game store sells it to the customer, they make $15 per copy, which means everyone here made $15. Now I mentioned the 5 times multiplier or the 4 times multiplier. Already we have the first complexity. Well, we have the first complexity when it comes to the cost of goods from the producer. But let's talk about the next complexity, which is game stores have different pricings, and there's MSRP and then standard pricing. So if you go into a game store charging full MSRP, the actual MSRP on that game might be $75. That's because brick and mortar stores have a much higher overhead, they provide additional reasons why you might go there, but that game might cost you $75 in a brick and mortar, and $60 online. So if the game store is an online game store, it's a 4 times multiplier. If it's the MSRP, it's a 5 times multiplier. That would be the basic rough approximation of the math for the 4 to 5 times multiplier. And this makes sense because everyone does need to make money. Everyone here is providing a service. The publisher is the one who came up with the game and put it into, well, brought it to life. The producer is making the game. The distributor takes care of distributing the game. We'll talk about that one in a second as far as the value that provides. The game store actually sells you the game. And so everyone needs to make money along the chain in order for this to be a viable product line, effectively. Now, as far as the value a game store and distributor provide is they effectively make the ability to buy games easier. The game store lets you buy the game from a single game store, as opposed to having to buy your games every single time directly from the publisher and paying all the shipping, doing all that, tracking everyone down. It consolidates it all for the customer. And the distributor does a similar thing for the sake of the game store. Most game stores can't afford to just buy a crate of a case or two of every single game that they want. So distributors buy from the publishers in bulk, and then they consolidate and sell that to the game stores. It kind of operates as a middleman, so to speak, between the game store and between the publisher to make it more viable. If you are a large enough game store, you might actually buy directly from the publisher. You might have more viability there. Although this is where we're going to get into pricing complications, because at all points in the chain, because theoretically, a publisher can turn around and sell the game to you for $30. Theoretically, a publisher can do that. They're selling it to the distributor for $30. Why not just sell it directly to you for $30? And the main reason there is ultimately that would be undercutting their partners. A distributor wouldn't work with a publisher who did that. Why should I buy your game for $30 to turn around and eventually get it sold for $60 if the customer is going to go straight to you for $30? So if a publisher wants their game to have a successful long-term life in the general distribution channels, meaning if they effectively want their game to get into game stores, you have to play ball with a system that allows everyone to make money in this chain. If you undercut the distributors and therefore the game stores, nobody's going to want to do business with you. This applies just as much when a game store is buying directly from a publisher. A game store has the same problem because you might say, oh, cut out the distributor. Game stores should buy directly from the publishers. Sometimes they can. And sometimes they can get marginal percentages of an increase of a better price point. You know, that game that they just paid $45 from to buy from the distributor, maybe they can get it for $44 from the publisher when they buy a case. It's that same logic. If you cut out different people and offer different price points, people won't work with you within that pipeline. So you have to keep your channels roughly in check, even when you're making more money. And it's a kind of win for the publisher to a certain extent, because if they sell you that $30 game directly to you for $60, they're great. They're going to go ahead and make that $45 instead of $15. But they also are doing that not because they want the $45 instead of $15. They're doing that in order to preserve the general life cycle of their game. So that's some basic starting point math. Okay, this is the 4 or 5 times multiplier, and that takes into account this kind of general sales cycle pipeline. Now, in the past years, there's generally been an increase. Lots of publishers mention higher multipliers, and there's 2 main reasons for this. One is because of the growth of the space, there's actually been a certain degree of, there's another new middleman kind of in place. This is a middleman that kind of connects the publisher of the game, they connect them to distributors. Meaning there are so many publishers nowadays, so many mom and pop stores effectively opening up their own, like, I can make a board game, and they're making board games, and they can be great board games. But it means distributors who might have been used to working with more established brands, effectively everyone is popping up with these games. And so not all distributors are going to work with you just because you made a game. You're like, hey, I have a game. Can I get you to carry my game? And they're like, no, there's so many games. 7,000 plus games come out a year. I can't take every single game. And so there's almost a new middleman who kind of connects distributors with the publishers by validating that those games are games that have a degree of, attention or audience reception, or they're likely, or that they're vetting them that they're good. And so that's a new middleman who is in the mix at different points. That's one reason why you're going to see an increased multiplier, because another middleman means more people need to make money. The other reason is simply the logistics of how much money you make on a game. Because again, let's go back to that $15 game. You're a publisher, you just made $15 on that game. Okay, you made $15 on your game. How much is a typical first print run? The numbers are a little all over the place. If you go and just Google it, you can find a lot of different sources. And maybe I'll try to reference some sources, but here's some rough numbers I'm going to give you. And I can give you some reasons as to why those numbers exist, but effectively, well, let's start with the numbers. If you are a small publisher, your first print run might be in the range of 1,000 to 3,000 games. It's very common for a minimum order quantity to be in that range because that's generally what a smaller print run is. If you're a medium publisher, it's going to be around 5,000-ish. And if you're a larger publisher, more established, or it's like maybe it's an IP game, it's around 10,000. Now again, you can validate these numbers just by looking at crowdfunded games and seeing how many games are sold. 1,000 backers is a pretty decent amount. It's still small, but it's pretty decent. But how many actually hit 5,000? Far, far fewer hit 5,000. How many hit 10,000? Far, far, far fewer. And you have to remember that that's effectively a pre-order system where the demand is known because people are paying for it. It is a much more of a risk. If you think your game would have gotten 10,000 backers, it's a risk to print 10,000 copies because you don't know that you're going to have 10,000 customers. So there's more risk when you're talking about a general retail pipeline, so to speak. So that's the rough numbers. And again, you can look at basics like Wingspan, the original first print run of Wingspan. I think Jamie Stegmaier did 10,000 copies of Wingspan. And that was something that he was told, like he's crazy that there wasn't enough demand for that. And obviously Wingspan massively eclipsed that. But that was an established publisher with multiple successful games, putting out a new game, and they did 10,000. That's on the larger end of print runs. So let's focus on those numbers. Okay, let's go through all three of those tiers: 1,000, 5,000, and 10,000. If you make 1,000 games, okay, again, my handwriting is terrible. I should not have done a written thing over here. If you make 1,000 games and you're making $15 per game, the math in here is not that hard. You are making $15,000. Okay, so if you come up with the first game, you make 1,000 copies, you sell it at $15 a game, you're making $15,000. That's not a lot of money. I know it sounds like a lot of money, but it's really not a lot of money. Because that $15,000, granted, because of the fact that you already paid for production, because we talked about the fact you already paid for the production costs because you are getting, that the $15 per copy, you're selling it for $30, great. But that means you're netting $15,000. That's taking into account the cost of goods, but not taking into account all the overhead. Who's paying the designer? Who's paying the publisher? Who else have their hands in the pot at any point? Do you have customer service of any kind? Are you valuing your own time? How many games are you making a year? Because if you make one game a year at $15,000, assume you are the artist and the designer and the only person involved, that's not enough to live on. If you don't have to pay anyone else because you did every single last thing, you don't even have an accountant, you're your own accountant. So if you have no other business costs at all, and you make one game a year at 1,000 copies at 15, you are not making money. This is a side hustle for you. And for many creators, there's a reason why it's a side hustle for a very, very long time. Let's say you're making 4 games a year. 4 games a year, 1,000 copies a year. I mean, first of all, that's a lot. Any small publisher, people who are usually getting 1,000 copies, 1,000 sales for their games are not making 4 games a year. The math gets very, very hard for you to sustainably be able to actually survive, or for your time to be valued in any way, shape, or form on all the steps it takes to bring a game to life, to design, to create, to play test. Again, maybe let's assume you're your own designer. Very often companies start that way. It takes a lot for you to actually bring that game to life, and you just walked away with $15,000 if you have a print run of 1,000. Now, if you have a print run of 5,000, the math becomes a lot better. That 5,000 is going to turn into 75,000. I think the main takeaway from this video is my handwriting, but we'll try not to keep commenting on that every 2 seconds. 75,000 is a lot more sustainable. It's still not enough, assuming you're not doing everything yourself. If you're doing everything yourself, $75,000, that's pretty good. That's assuming you sold 5,000. Keeping in mind, it is very hard for a newcomer to sell 5,000. That's already more established and that leaves very little room for error. It depends on how many games you put out, but it depends other costs, the designers, the publishers, all these things. There's artists, because you can't make that many games a year yourself. At 75,000, you have a chance of actually breathing. At 10,000 copies, the math's pretty basic, you just double the 75,000, you're making 150,000. So at 10,000 copies, you have a lot more room to breathe. You can possibly make a single game a year and pay the designer, artist, and customer service and all that, and still be walking away with a decent amount of money at the end of it, if you are able to sell 10,000 copies. Do me a favor and take a look at all the crowdfunding campaigns you're currently looking at in any way, shape, or form, and see how many of them actually have 10,000 backers. It is rarer. It is usually a much more established company with a very big audience, often associated with some sort of IP or a sequel to a previous product. It is very hard to get to that 10,000 copy real breathing room area. Because even at 5,000, things are going to be tight, especially when you have to pay other people. Which is why there is a degree of sometimes that multiplier is higher. If you're only making 1,000 copies and you can't afford to live on 15,000 a year, maybe that multiplier goes up to an 8 times multiplier because that's going to allow extra padding for you to make money. That multiplier gets more complicated. There's a lot of factors that go into it. That 4 to 5 times is a baseline general idea, and things have gotten significantly more complicated since then. That's kind of the basic math of pricing a game and then trying to figure out what your multiplier is, who's making money along the way, and all of that. Which brings us to the next conversation. Increases to your cost of goods. Now I'm going to go into extremes here, specifically to show you how things play out, because I think it's easier to explain, it's easier to absorb once you go into extremes, and then you dial it back to the less extreme area. This will hopefully make sense. Let's pretend that you have a tariff in place. The tariff, as many people have correctly pointed out, is on the production costs of the goods. It's not on the final price point of the goods, it's on the production costs. So now, the price point of your game is effectively going to change. You're going to have to factor in a whole different scale. Now, before I go into the math of an actual tariff, I'm going to go to the extreme. This is the part where I said I'm going to go to the extreme because I want to show you kind of how it plays out at large numbers. And then after that, it's just an issue of scaling it back down to smaller numbers where it's practically at. Let's pretend for a second, because I think the main point of objection I've sometimes seen is just have that tariff passed on as the final cost, and it's not as bad. Sure, it's more expensive, but it's not doom and gloom. So you just tack on that extra, 145% goes to the manufacturing cost of the game. So pretending a $10 game, so let's say you had because $10 is going to be easier than $15, so a $10 game is no longer going to cost you $10 to produce, it'll cost you $24.50, but sure, to the end customer, that $10 that would have been $40 or $50, might instead be $54.50, whatever it is. Meaning it's not going to massively increase the cost. Your 145% tariff should only equate to like a 20%-ish bump to the customer. Okay, that's something I've seen as a general idea. It's not as bad, but I want to show you why it's more complicated than that. Let's assume for a second a $100 increase to the cost of a game. And again, I'm going to dial it back. I just think it's easier to understand if we go to large numbers and then dial it back. So if you have a $10 game, it previously cost you $10 to produce, which means using our previous example, that would have ended up being a roughly $50 MSRP, or in a more practical setting, you might buy it online for only $40, okay? So only $40. Let's pretend your $10 game now costs $110 to produce. Let's say there's an additional $100, it's a 1,000% tariff, and you're going to add $100 to the cost of the game. So now it's $110, and if you only tack that on to the final customer at the end of it, so now it's going to be, I'm not going to ignore the MSRP, we're just going to focus on this number because I don't want to get into MSRP things. So now that $40 game is now $140 because you've only passed it on. You have not multiplied that cost at all. Okay, so once it passes through all the chains, everyone makes their same $10 per game, and the customer pays $140 for a game that is costing the original publisher $110. Again, we're increasing the cost by $100, and we're trying to pass on the cost only to the end customer. Because again, this is the proposed thing I'm seeing about tariffs. This, hypothetically, let's assume for a second the customer is willing to pay that $140 for that game. Okay, so they're paying $140 because we have to assume it for this example to work. But I'm trying to show you how passing a cost directly to the customer and ignoring the tiers along the way is going to be problematic. Because that customer is spending $140 from their pocket. They are spending $140, and from that $140 that they're spending, everyone along the way, the distributor, I'm going to just write publisher, I'm going to write the publisher, the distributor, and the game store, they're each making $10 off that customer's $140 spending. Okay. The problem here is that customer spending is going to shrink if things get more expensive. The customers are not going to buy the same number of games if your $10 game if your $40 game, if your game that was previously $40 becomes $140, you're not spending the same amount on board games. You're just not. I think we can all agree. How much it changes, that's an interesting conversation. At that price point, it might go down to zero. But whatever it is, a price increase to people who have limited budgets on things does result in a shrinking of the amount you spend. So if you had a semi-fixed gaming budget, okay, let's pretend for the sake of this example, let's pretend previously you were spending $400 a year on games. Because each game costs you $40, you bought 10 games a year on average, you were spending $400 a year. Okay, so your $400 a year that you were spending at that price point was effectively giving, because again, everyone's making $10 per game. So each game, if everyone's making $10 per game from your $400 a year, then everyone along the way was making, 10 times, why can't I do math right now? 10 times 10. Everyone's making $100 a year off of your $400 a year. Okay, that's what everyone is making at $400 a year. If you jump your spending significantly higher, let's say you go from, let's make the math, let's say you're saying going to $560 a year. Games get more expensive, so now instead of spending $400 a year, you are spending $560 a year. Because that basically, I think that math works out to this times 4. Yeah, so now you're spending $560 a year, and previously you were getting 10 games for that 400, and now you're getting 4 games for that 560. That's 560 divided by 140. You're getting 4 games. You have to increase your budget because, listen, we all want some games. So you increased your budget. Your $560 a year, if the end cost gets passed directly on just to the customer and no one else along the way, now results in all of these people, they're making $40 a year from you. So the publisher, the distributor, and the game store are trying to survive on only $40 a year, despite the fact that you increased your spending. You increased the amount you spent on board games because they got more expensive, and now they're all making less than half of what they were making, even with you increasing your amount of spending. Hopefully this kind of makes sense. The general idea I'm going for here is when you go ahead and only pass the cost on to the very end user, and that's it, then first of all, you're going to buy less games. And granted, I used extreme examples, but the math doesn't change even with small examples. If your $40 a year game now costs $54.50, which is what 145% tariff would do, because it's $14.50 on all the stages, but you don't do it on all the stages, you pass it on directly to the end consumer. So your $10 game is now costing you $24.50, everyone's making $10, and you're spending $54.50 on your $40 game. You are almost certainly spending less money over the course of the year, which means publisher, distributor, and game store are all trying to survive on less spending from the consumer. That's why you can't simply pass the entire amount of the tariff onto the end customer and say, listen, it's not that big a deal. There has to be some degree of multiplier in place in order to ensure that everyone along the pathway is still making a livable wage, is still able to actually run their business. You can't go from making $100 per consumer down to $40 and expect things to survive. The math there is extreme, obviously, but that's more to drive home the point, because once we get the idea that passing it on to the end consumer at the end is going to result in shrinkage along the entire line, yes, the shrinkage will not be as bad with a smaller jump, but it certainly will be something that's in place. If the tariffs stay in place, there's not a ton of options for publishers. Of course, they want to go ahead and try to find cheaper production if that's a possibility. I'm not getting into that in this video. I'm trying to keep this video very localized and focused. But it does mean that to a certain extent, publishers are going to have to make choices. Let's pretend that we know for a fact that the 145% tariff is going to stay in place for the next 5 years. Let's just pretend we know that. I'm just making up a number. I'm saying, because right now the biggest hope is that it goes away. That's just a negotiating tactic, and it goes away and everything gets better. But if it doesn't go away, publishers can't take a $10 game and now make it cost, I think the math on it was, a $10 game would be, let's see, $10, if you pass the tariff on at a full multiplier across the way, would be $24.50, $49 would be $98. A $10 game would cost $98 if you fully, meaning previously that game would have cost you $40, and now it's costing $98. Okay, that's going to be the shift if you fully passed on the multiplier along the way. And you can't do that. No one's paying $98 for a $40 game. But if you only charge $54.50, then these publisher, distributor, and game store are not making the money they need to make. Which means likely what would happen is one of two things, and each publisher will have to choose differently. The first is that people will change the ratio of what's being made along the way to try to split the difference. That $10 game is not going to cost $98, but they can't do $54.50 either. Maybe it becomes a $70 game. So that way, you are paying more, but you're not paying double. You're paying significantly more. They're making less, and there's a degree of compromise, of splitting the pain between the customer and between the people along the chain who need to make money in order for the supply chain to exist. The other thing that is a possibility is there will be publishers who have to figure out ways to cut people out from their supply chain. That's the other way to survive. A publisher might sit there and say, hey, we're now only direct to consumer. That's the only option we have, because if direct to consumer, we can go ahead and make that game. We pay the $14.50, and we can turn around and sell it to consumer for $40 because we're paying $24.50, and we're selling it for $40 directly to the consumer. We get less sales, but we're making more per game. Instead of making $10 per game, we're making $15.50, and we're getting less sales. Maybe we can make that work. Maybe that's a possibility we can make happen. Maybe we try to just cut out the distributor, but not the game store. Maybe there's a middle compromise. Maybe we only sell to customers and the game stores, and we cut out the distributor entirely. And again, it's going to mean less sales because lots of game stores will only purchase from a distributor, but at least we have some options on the table. Meaning, if the tariffs are in place, you either see things get significantly more expensive, or to some extent, people try to figure out where they can cut out whatever middlemen possible to just make it a viable business. And that's a hard choice to make because most publishers rely on crowdfunding, but then they also rely on the retail chain. Most publishers, you get the initial boost from you do your crowdfunding, you make more money per game, you get your game out there, you hopefully pay for the main upfront costs of making the game, the designer, the artist, and all that, and then you figure out from there, okay, great, now we get into retail, making less money, but that's going to be the long-term growth of our actual company. The main point here, the main entire point of this video, is to try to illustrate the complexities as to, first of all, the way companies have to price their games. Second of all, how little most companies are making per game, even though it seems like a big number. Once you take into account all the various factors, there's so little money being made per game, much less than you think. And then the third aspect is to talk about the nature of tariffs and why saying, hey, just tack it on to the customer at the end and that's it. That's a significantly harder conversation because everyone has to still try to make money with less money being spent on average in the pool. I said that last part poorly. If you're spending more money per game, if you're distributing your money that you would normally spend on games across more expensive games and therefore buying fewer games, then publishers, distributors, game stores have to take that into account as they deal with their pricing. Hopefully this in some way cleared up why the math is complicated. I'm not looking for you to agree or disagree. Some of you already know this, some of you don't. Some of you will watch all of this and have 17 reasons why things should be different. I hear all that. There's a million possible solutions. My only goal in this video is to illustrate that it's complicated. It's not as simple as saying, just tack it on to the end. That has costs that have to be paid for that to work as well. Anyways, until next time, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co. I may be doing other videos on the general nature of the current landscape. I'm trying to keep them less argumentative and more just dabbling into a subject, but we'll see what happens.